The Essex story and the subsequent tale of survival are what Reality Threads will be covering today. Herman Melville, a 32-year-old novelist, had high expectations for his new work in July 1852, despite the book's poor reviews and lackluster sales. His first visit to the Massachusetts island of Nantucket was that month when he took a steamboat there. Captain Ahab and the Pequod, the legendary ship of the novel, call this island their home port. Meeting local officials, dining out, and taking in the sights of the village he had only envisioned before, Melville lived the life of a tourist. On his last day in Nantucket, he greeted the 60-year-old captain of the ship Essex, which had been attacked and sunk by a sperm whale in the 1820 tragedy that inspired Melville's novel. When the Essex went down, Captain George Pollard Jr. was only 29 years old. He made it back to Nantucket and took the helm of a second ship, Two Brothers. 2 years later, the ship ran aground on a coral reef, permanently marking the skipper as a seafaring misfortune. No owner dared entrust him with another vessel. Pollard spent his last years on land as a night watchman. While the whale sank Pollard's ship, Melville only briefly mentioned him in Moby Dick. According to Melville's later writings, the two barely spoke throughout his visit. Nevertheless, Melville understood that Pollard's suffering at sea had persisted long after the demise of the Essex, and he had no intention of reawakening the captain's dreadful recollections. "He was a nobody to the islanders," Melville wrote. "He was the most remarkable man I have ever met. He was also the most modest and meek." Before telling the tale to a missionary named George Bennett, Pollard had shared it with fellow captains over dinner not long after his rescue from the Essex incident. To Bennett, the story felt like a confession. It was undeniably grim. There was no food for 92 days of restless nights on a leaky boat. His remaining crew members went completely insane in the severe heat. The thought of consuming one's own flesh was truly terrifying. Even worse, two young men, one of them Pollard's cousin, Owen Coffin, met a tragic fate. Beyond that, he could barely speak of the horror. "The memory is frying my brain," he told the missionary. "I hardly know what I say." Melville was aware that the crisis aboard the Essex began on August 14, 1819, only 2 days into the ship's 2.5-year whaling expedition from Nantucket. A squall nearly sank the 87-foot-long ship, ripping the topgallant sail from its mast. Still, Pollard persisted, and 5 weeks later, they reached Cape Horn. However, the 20-man crew soon discovered that the waters off South America were almost devoid of whales. Determined, they set off for distant whaling grounds in the South Pacific, far from any coastline. At Charles Island in the Galapagos, the Essex anchored to restock, and the crew collected approximately 60 tortoises, each weighing about 100 pounds. Then, disaster struck. A crew member inadvertently started a fire, which spread rapidly during the dry season. Fleeing amid the flames, Pollard's men barely made it out alive. Even the following day, they could still see the island's smoke plume rising into the sky. Pollard, furious, vowed revenge on whoever had started the fire. The fire on Charles Island left lasting consequences. It turned the land into a barren wasteland for years, likely causing the extinction of the Floriana, mockingbird, and tortoise. Months passed, and the Essex whaleboats had been on a successful hunt when, in November 1820, thousands of miles from land, they found themselves engaged in what the crew called Nantucket sleigh rides. First mate Owen Chase, just 23 years old, remained on board the Essex to oversee repairs while Pollard pursued a whale. In the distance, Chase spotted an enormous whale, an estimated 85 feet long, lying motionless, its head turned toward the ship. Then, without warning, the beast charged. "Coming down for us at great celerity," Chase recalled, "at about 3 knots. The whale rammed the ship head-on, delivering such an enormous and violent blow that it nearly threw the crew off their feet. The beast then swam under the ship, thrashing furiously in the waves. I could distinctly see him smite his jaws together, as if distracted with rage and fury," Chase remembered. Then, the whale disappeared. As the crew worked on repairing the hull and manning the pumps, a shout rang out. "Here he is!" They turned, just in time to see the whale coming again. This time, it swam at them with its beak partially above the water. Chase estimated it was moving at 6 knots. With another devastating impact, the whale struck the bow just beneath the cathead, then vanished forever. As water flooded the ship, the crew had only one option: lower the boats, and try to load them with navigation equipment, bread, water, and supplies before the Essex capsized. From his position aboard a whaling boat, Pollard watched in horror as his ship sank. Rushing back to the Essex, he was overwhelmed. "My God, Mr. Chase, what's the matter?" he asked in disbelief. Chase's response was grim. "That ship was stove in by a whale," he replied. Another boat returned, its crew stunned into silence. Pale and speechless, their captain sat, motionless. Chase later noted that some of the men still didn't grasp the full gravity of their situation. As the Essex slowly sank, the sailors refused to abandon it, and Pollard attempted to devise a strategy. 20 men and 3 boats made up the total. Pollard wished to set sail, and they determined that the Marquesas Islands, part of the Society Islands, were the nearest landmass. The crew, along with Chase, persuaded him that the islands were inhabited by cannibals, and that sailing south would be their best option. One of the most ironic decisions in naval history. They would have a much longer journey before reaching land. But they could ride the trade winds or be spotted by another whaling vessel. It seems that only Pollard grasped the gravity of avoiding the islands. As discussed by Nathaniel Philbrick in his book In the Heart of the Sea, The Tragedy of the Whale Ship Essex, traders had been visiting the islands for years without incident, despite persistent stories of cannibalism. They set out from the Essex in their 20-foot vessels. Difficulties arose almost immediately. As they consumed their daily rations, the men began to dehydrate, and the bread became saturated with salt water. The sun was relentless. 2 weeks later, they reached Henderson Island, only to find it completely deserted. Another week passed, and as time wore on, the men's supplies dwindled. 3 of them ultimately chose to risk their lives on dry land rather than return to the boat. Though it would put more strain on the supplies for those remaining at sea, no one could blame them. By mid-December, weeks into their journey, the ships began taking on water. More whales threatened the crew during the night. The dwindling rations took their toll on Chase's boat in January. One man lost his grip on reality, leapt to his feet, and demanded water and a dinner napkin. Soon after, he suffered the most horrid and frightful convulsion, and died the next morning. Humanity must shudder at the dreadful recital of what came next, the author wrote. The crew dismembered him, stripped the flesh from his bones, and then cut him open to remove his heart. We then stitched him up as neatly as possible before releasing him to the sea. Afterward, they cooked his internal organs on a flat stone and consumed them. Over the next week, 3 more sailors perished. Their remains were prepared and eaten. 1 boat disappeared. Eventually, the boats carrying Chase and Pollard lost sight of one another entirely. A disturbing pattern emerged. An increased consumption of human flesh seemed to drive the survivors' hunger even further. The men on both boats grew too weak to speak. Aboard Pollard's vessel, the 4 remaining sailors realized that without more food, they would soon die. 9 weeks after the Essex sank, on February 6, 1821, teenager Charles Ramsdell proposed drawing lots to determine the next sacrifice. This grim maritime tradition dates back to the mid-17th century. Following Ramsdell's suggestion, the crew of Pollard's boat drew lots. The fateful task fell to young Owen Coffin, Pollard's first cousin. Pollard had promised Coffin's mother that he would protect her son. "Hey there, my son," the captain cried out. "If you don't like your lot, I'll shoot the first man that touches you." But Coffin remained resolute. "It's just as good as any other," he replied. The second lot, which determined who would carry out the execution, fell to Ramsdell. After a long pause, Coffin leaned his head against the gunwale of the boat. Ramsdell pulled the trigger. He was soon dispatched, Pollard later recalled, and nothing of him was left. On February 18th, following 89 grueling days at sea, the 3 survivors in Chase's boat spotted a distant sail. In a desperate chase, they managed to capture the attention of an English ship, which rescued them 300 miles away. Meanwhile, only 2 men remained aboard Pollard's boat, Pollard himself and Charles Ramsdell. They had broken open their last crewman's bones to extract the marrow, as these were the only remaining scraps of sustenance. As the days dragged on, they couldn't stop fixating on the bones scattered around the boat. 7 days after the rescue of Chase and his men, the American ship Dauphin spotted Pollard's boat. Once aboard the Dauphin, the The two emaciated men were still comforting themselves by sucking on the bones of their deceased crewmates, a practice they were reluctant to abandon. In Valparaiso, the 5 survivors from the Essex were reunited. After resting, they set off for Nantucket. Philbrick claims that after Pollard recovered, he went out to dinner with several captains and revealed the details of the Essex wreck and his terrifying 3 months at sea. Not one but 2 of the captains in attendance took notes, with one describing Pollard's story. On Dulce Island, they discovered the 3rd boat, years later. The most distressing narrative that has ever come to my knowledge. On Henderson Island, 3 other men had survived for nearly 4 months, subsisting largely on shellfish and bird eggs, before an Australian ship rescued them. Upon their arrival in Nantucket, the Essex survivors were met with a warm welcome. Among mariners, cannibalism was sometimes rationalized as a necessary evil in extreme circumstances. Those who escaped such disasters often refused to consume human flesh, instead using corpses as fish bait. However, Philbrick notes that the Essex crew had been stranded in waters almost entirely devoid of marine life. Still, no one was willing to forgive Captain Pollard as easily, because he had devoured his own cousin. One scholar would later refer to it as gastronomic incest. Owen Coffin's mother could not bear to be in Pollard's presence. After his time at sea ended, Pollard remained in Nantucket for the rest of his life. Legend has it that every year on the anniversary of the Essex disaster, he would fast in remembrance of his lost crewmates. By 1852, both Moby Dick and Melville had begun their own descent into obscurity. Despite his high expectations, the book sold only a few thousand copies during his lifetime. After a string of failed novels, Melville spent 19 years working as a customs inspector in New York before retiring into seclusion. Tragically, both of his sons died as he turned to drinking. Abandoning novels in favor of poetry, he sank into depression. Yet, he could never shake the thought of George Pollard's fate.